You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author Rachel Shabi and the political commentator Benedict Spence. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, unsurprisingly, the Financial Times leads with today's announcement that the UK economy has fallen into recession, with the paper suggesting it creates another electoral hurdle for Rishi Sunak. The front page highlights the UK's recession and Chancellor Hunt's forecast of an inflation cut. The Guardian reveals that Rishi Sunak has been cautioned against public service cuts during the UK's recession. Meanwhile, the Express reports that a senior government official has told British Gas it could use its record profits to cut energy bills immediately. The Metro predicts a baby boom after new research found that blasts of ultrasound can give new life to dead sperm cells. And a talking dog is on the front of the Daily Star. It can apparently call its owner by her name and tell her, "I love you." I wonder if it did say that on Valentine's Day. We need evidence. A reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Rachel Shabi and Benedict Spence. Welcome to you both. We've obviously got to start with the recession, the announcement made officially today. Let's have a look at the front page. A lot of the terminology in the headlines use this word slips into recession as though it sort of came in by stealth. Rachel?
It did not come in by stealth, as everybody up and down this country will know, because it didn't feel particularly polite. It's been like this for a very long time. It's now been confirmed officially that the UK has slipped into recession. But as your own correspondents explained earlier, in real terms, when you take into account population growth, measure that against GDP, so domestic growth per head, has been falling for the last every single quarter since 2022, which is devastating. And of course, that's what everybody feels in terms of just not being able to stretch wage packets to the very basic necessities and having to make the most horrendous of cuts. And we know that this has been going on for quite some time. We also know that the government's approach to it is insane. I mean, you can see an economy that's flatlining, and while the economy is flatlining, the Conservatives, the government's response has been, well, let's just cut off more oxygen and also starve the heart of a blood supply. I mean, it's just basic thing about a recession is that you have to jumpstart it back into action by investing into the economy. This government has done the precise opposite.
Benedict, what the government, the paper says, the Treasury insider quoted as saying that the recession was the result of high interest rates, which was needed to bring inflation down.
Yeah, to try and take heat out of the economy. There are some positives. I'm just going to start with the little positives before I dive straight back into the negatives. The sole positives are that the initial signs from December and January make it look as if this might be a very short-lived recession, actually, that the economy might look, in fact, to be growing. Now, obviously, we'll have to wait a couple more weeks to see whether that bears out, but this could actually be a very short recession. However, simply having been in a recession at all is going to be devastating for Rishi Sunak, who came in on this idea that he was Mr. Manager, he was the one that understood it, he'd been in the Treasury, he was good with the figures, and that actually he promised all of these things, he'd get inflation down, he'd get the economy growing. Well, he hasn't really been able to do very many of the things that he did promise. And ultimately, you've got the government coming out today and suggesting, well, OK, that this was an unfortunate situation, however, we did need to try to taper off inflation. That has come down. the likelihood is it is going to go up again later this year, and that is because inflation that is affecting this country is broadly out of the government's control. Actually, you need to look at what's happening in the Gulf of Aden to see why it is going to come up again. And earlier on, of course, the war in Ukraine is what initially led to that sort of massive spike in inflation because of events there. So it's one thing for the government to say, OK, yes, we're in recession, but we've managed to sort of taper down inflation, but it's going to come back. And so I think any sort of suggestion of economic credibility is going to be completely shredded. But I mean, as Rachel said, it's not unexpected. People felt this. Frank Luntz says people don't just read, oh, recession, they go, oh, well, now we're in a recession. They've been feeling it for months, and they do feel it for months before it becomes official. And I think, the proof is in the polling, ultimately, is that you just look at how badly the Conservatives are doing as they promise this tax cut and that tax cut, and it doesn't budge anything because people are just feeling that much poorer. That is the reality of the recession that's been going on for a very long time, actually, not just the last couple of months. If we're being truthful, let's even take COVID and Brexit out of the equation. The economy of the UK has almost flatlined since 2008. The record of the Conservatives since they came in promising to fix the economy has been dreadful. One thing that the Conservatives might say is, well, you look at the rest of Europe, they're not doing too well at the moment, but ultimately you step back over that much longer period, 14 years, the UK is struggling when you compare it to, say, Germany or France or any of its other competitors.
Rachel, let's move on to the Financial Times. Their headline there, Britain slide into recession creates another big election hurdle for Sunak, obviously.
I mean, obviously, but honestly, I'm less concerned by the electoral fortunes of Rishi Sunak. I'm more concerned by the impact that this recession is having up and down the country. I mean, if you have an economy that is flatlining to this extent, by the way, the whole thing about inflation is nonsense. Can you explain?
Which aspect of it?
Well, can you explain to me why in the Eurozone inflation hasn't risen to the same degree or has fallen quicker?
Well, that's partly because most other countries in the Eurozone...
I didn't mean actually explain to me. I just meant there's a logical flaw in your argument.
It's not a logical
You asked him to
There isn't a logical flaw in my argument at all. And if you allow me to answer, I will answer.
Look,
if you give me that opportunity, I will.
The reality is that there are other countries in the world who are facing the exact same external forces.
Well, that's what Rachel Reeves has been saying today,
and who are doing better, absolutely. And, you only have to look at the US, for instance, that at least Biden has understood that you need to invest in an economy.
What does the US do?
The inflation-busting equivalent of a Green New Deal.
What have they banned the export of that we could have, but we don't?
Pumping millions. Are you going to let me speak?
Well, I mean, you asked me the question, and I'd really like to... I know, but you gave me that opportunity, and I'm so desperate.
This is getting silly.
I'll let you finish.
OK, Rachel, go ahead, Rachel.
The idea that you need to invest in an economy to grow it is the bit that is worrying me, because not only are the Conservatives not talking about that, Labour isn't talking about that either. And so what worries me isn't Rishi Sunak's fortunes at the next election. It's the reality that in this country we have a political class that does not have an answer to the crisis that we're in. It does not have an answer to this flatlining economy, to the fact that people's wages are in no way able to keep them afloat, to the fact that public services are shredded, to the fact that we do not have an answer to the climate emergency that the world is facing, but also that this country is facing and that we're seeing increasingly in floods and the like, which are very expensive as well. And so what worries me is not the fortunes of Sunak, it's the fact that the entire political class, whether it's Labour, whether it's the Tories, do not have an answer to this recession that we're in, and which, Benedict, you are right, has been going on since 2008.
Let's let Benedict come in now.
I've got nothing to say, actually. It was all a bluff. No, it's... I think Rachel touches on something very interesting there, which is, of course, not just that we're talking about the Conservatives and their electoral fortunes, because they're not going to win the next general election. It's as much about the Labour Party here and what is their plan. Now, what I wanted to say about the United States is, in the last couple of years, the United States has become one of, bordering on the biggest exporter of fossil fuels in the world, thanks to its shale gas revolution. We don't have that in this country. Europe doesn't have it. That is partly why the UK in particular is struggling. The United States has also stopped the export of LNG exactly at this time because it wants to avoid these inflationary pressures that it sees coming down the hill. But that's what a lot of this is about. It's about energy. What is it the Labour scrapped earlier this week? Was it the £28 billion green pledge for new technologies, part of which is about energy? Well, ultimately, your economy is always going to struggle if you don't have a ready, available supply of cheap energy. We have decided that green energy is obviously much more preferable to just the cheapest of the cheap energy, but we aren't even pursuing that. And I think that that's a real concern for the Labour Party, is that they haven't told us what the future of energy in this country is actually going to be. It's all very well saying, oh, it's going to be wind farms, but this government has been struggling with wind farms in itself. Is it going to be nuclear power? There doesn't seem to be much desire for that. So you're sort of struggling, looking around and going, well, are we going to be dependent entirely on bringing in more gas? Because that's currently the situation, and that is not proving particularly good for us.
There might be a mix of several options for the future. Let's just move on to The Guardian, Rachel, now. And this, well, basically, they're saying that Rishi Sunak's being warned against austerity as a way of battling through the recession. And the unions in particular saying that the Chancellor looking to balance the books by forcing more austerity onto services already on their knees.
Yeah, the unions have called that an outrage, and rightly. And I'm glad that, you know, he is being warned about this because, you know, Jeremy Hunt does the TV rounds and says, oh, well, you know, I'm looking at making cuts to public services. And nobody actually stops and says, wait a minute, what cuts? Where are you going to cut? Are you going to cut from the NHS, which is already shredded to the bone, where millions of people are on waiting lists, where over the winter we have elderly people being treated in hospital corridors? Are you going to cut from schools, which again are shredded to the bone, where school children don't have pens and papers? Which bit of the public services that you have already ravaged are you going to ravage even more? And he doesn't have an answer to that because it's completely unsustainable.
Well, meanwhile, Benedict, the Mail saying now be bold and go for big tax cuts, Mr Hunt.
Well, again, though, then you've got the problem, which is that you're going to have to either cut public spending or you're going to have to borrow an awful lot of money. And I don't think that is... We seem to think that it is something you can just keep on doing, is borrowing more and more.
Well, you can.
Well, you can't necessarily if you're paying... What is the percentage of the UK GDP that we currently spend on servicing our debt?
Can we
It's about 12 to 13% of our entire budget every year we spend on interest payments. It is not sustainable. Ultimately, the government has got to decide, and the Labour Party has got to decide this as well, and it has to have this honest conversation with the British people. The tax burden is at its highest in the post-war era at the moment, and the services are not working. So you're going to have to tax people more to try to get more money to get these services to work, as well as trying to streamline them. Ultimately, if you want to cut taxes...
That's being taxed? That's the bit we never talk about.
Well, of course, but this is the thing.
Why not tax the people
if you're
who can
going
afford
to have,
it?
as you said, if you're going to cut taxes, then there are going to be cuts
tax wealth,
to
but not
services.
income.
And this is the difficulty that the Conservatives has, because Boris Johnson's majority was not built on a small state, low tax. It was about getting people back into work. It was about services. It was about the bigger picture, if you like. It was a different kind of conservatism, and it's one that doesn't square with the future vision that Jeremy Hunt is trying to sell people.
OK, and he's also partly promised tax cuts. We'll leave it there for the moment. Benedict and Rachel, we can take a break. Coming up, Israeli forces storm Gaza's largest functioning hospital, claiming it's a base of operations for Hamas. We'll discuss that next. Do stay with us. Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, Rachel Shabi and Benedict Spence. Let's take a look at the FT, but a story that's elsewhere in the papers and one that we've been covering today. And this is the attack on the hospital, the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis in Gaza, and after an Israeli raid. Rachel.
Yeah, this is yet another horrifying story in months and months of horrifying stories of this just appalling assault on Gaza, which has left many of us just in disbelief that it has gone on for so long and has cost so much in Palestinian lives. Some 28,000 killed now, and some 10,000 of them children. Israeli forces stormed this hospital, Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. It's the last remaining functional hospital in the Gaza Strip. It's also where a lot of people are seeking refuge. And storming a hospital is quite blatantly a war crime atop many that have been taken place in Gaza. I think for a lot of people, we're just looking at the images coming out of the Strip in utter despair that this has been able to carry on for so long. We had the International Court of Justice just a few weeks ago say that there was plausible risk of a genocide taking place in Gaza. The logical next step would be for the international community to demand a ceasefire. It's unbelievable.
We're just looking at pictures now of the hospital, but the IDF has said that they had credible intelligence that Hamas was holding hostages in the hospital.
I think the key to what Rachel says is that it has just kept on going on and on, because it has just kept on going on and on. And I think that speaks to the atmosphere around this conflict among Israel's allies and also allies of the Palestinians. There is neither the stomach amongst Israel's allies to really put the brakes on them to try to really force them to stop, and actually amongst those countries that have been the most vociferous, at least in public, in terms of condemning Israel, there is not really the power there to do very much. You know, we're in a very changed world to the last time Israel was engaged in Gaza. The key thing, I think, now is we have to think about what is the exit strategy, because what would really compound the carnage that's been going on in Gaza is if there wasn't actually an established plan for what is going to happen to the poor people that live there afterwards, once Israel has achieved whatever it says its military objectives are. Are they to just be sort of left to their own devices? Are they going to be administered by Israel? Is it going to involve the Palestinian Authority? Will it involve other bodies? Will it involve allies, Egypt, the Gulf states? Who knows? That, I think, is the question, because I haven't really seen much in terms of an exit strategy. All I've sort of seen is this, you know, Netanyahu saying, no, we're going to do what we're going to do. And after that, who knows? It's sort of open-ended. But ultimately, the horror for the Palestinian people in Gaza will continue if there isn't a long-term plan after that. And I think there really needs to be some hint from the Israeli government beyond simply the military plan. What is it actually your plan to rebuild Gaza for the people that live there? And so that the mistakes aren't repeated again, and so that actually the resentment isn't allowed to sort of fester.
What happens afterwards is the big question. We'll just finish on The Guardian, Rachel, and the story of Carmen Smith. Not your average peer, says the headline. At 27, I think she's the youngest peer to enter the House of Lords.
She's the youngest peer. She's going to become a life peer, and she wants to abolish the House of Lords. So that's quite refreshing in and of itself. She also says she, wants to put Wales on the map in the House of Lords and give Wales a voice in a house where it has, quite often been lacking.
But for the meantime, she'll sit in the Lords before that day comes when the House of Lords is abolished, as per her will.
She can hasten its demise.
We shall see.